both Jocelyn, both Jocelyn and George have had the chance to read the paper beforehand, and they will share their respective reflections before we get into a broader discussion with all of us. And then finally, we will close the discussion latest at 6 o'clock European time for those of you in Europe. So with that, without further ado, Claire or Danielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. Before I share my screen, just a short presentation of each of us, as some of you may not know you. We don't know all of you, at least. So I'm Claire. I'm a sociologist at INRAE, as Barbara said, in Avignon, in the south of France. And Danielle?
And Danielle, I'm introduced in INRA also, and I'm ecologist. Working on ecologisation of agriculture and transition. So we are not specialists of resilience. It's
okay. So and this paper, as Barbara said, has been elaborated with Ika Downhofer, who works at BOKU in Austria. Actually, it's not a big deal at all that you received this version. It's just that it was not in a nice feature like we would have put it in PDF and so on, but no worries. So the idea with this paper, it's not a review for those who have looked at it. It's rather a reflection, a kind of critical paper aimed at raising discussions and also critics and comments, of course. And this came out from our shared surprise and astonishment among the three of us with the increasing use of the notion of food resilience, especially in France, which became a buzzword that circulates across scientific arenas, international institutions and national ones here, lots of multi-stakeholders groups, public policies, social movements, and so on. And I was surprised in my fieldwork to see it used by many networks, many of these kinds of networks and actors. And Danielle and Ika, who are much more than me, like specialists in a way of the notion or skilled to talk about the notion as a scientific one, I mean, as ecologists and agronomists, were also questioned by this transformation of the uses of the concept. So, of course, this is not that surprising, as all the more than in France, the term resilience, the notion of resilience has been very much used in psychology about the resilience to personal tragedies, difficulties, and so on. So in the French context, it's not as surprising that this concept that might appear as quite simple, adaptable, relying as well, and reassuring in a context of crisis may know such a success in a way. But what we want to discuss is how these uses in their diversity tend to transform the meaning given to the very notion of resilience, as well as the framing of food issues as such. So that's why we try to set up, the three of us, this argumentation, this discussion based on these recent trends. So this paper is based on our complementary disciplines from social and natural sciences and our expertise, as I said, on my side, rather on food systems and related debates and networks. On Ika's side, she's worked a lot on the resilience at the scale of farm and production systems, and Danielle has long been involved in in the Resilience Alliance movement and working on socio-ecological resilience. So we proceeded, and we're going to present this paper in 3 steps. I'm going to start, and then Daniel will do the second part, present the second part. First, with the trajectory and an attempt to map, kind of mapping of these uses. Then synthesis of what we think are contradictions, ambiguities, confusions, and also processes of invisibilization that come along with this concept. And, oh, sorry. I was trying to look at the discussion at the same time. And we will finish with something more like prospective or programmatic, which is a short discussion about how, despite these limits, the notion of resilience might shed light on some dimensions, some aspects of agri-food transition. So, this trajectory that we to establish on the notion on this figure above the timeline, we try to mention what are the important, some key milestones or steps in international context and institutions, in France more specifically, and below the timeline, some key or some milestone in the use of the concept in the scientific communities. So coming from other fields of, especially of physics, the notion has first expanded to an application and a conceptualization about living ecosystems with the notion of ecosystems or social ecosystems resilience early already in the mid-80s, before it came to other issues. It has then in the policy and the and larger society debates been mainly and primarily used about tragedies and risks. So especially in the early 2000s and institutionally after, you remember, the 24 tsunami and the following Hyogo framework in 2005, which was a framework that inspired an application or translation of this notion to food security a few years later, or in the following years, that was formalized, institutionalized by the FAO in 2010. In parallel, and also providing concepts and approaches, methods for this, the notion of community resilience has been developed around the same period in parallel to the approach of resilience in link with risks and tragedies and so on. And then it's in the late 2000 that we increasingly see this application to food systems as such, with a conceptualization, an often quoted conceptualization, which is the one from Tendel and colleagues from 2015, knowing that in between there's also been quite a few application to agriculture with as I said before, the notion of farm resilience that Ika Darnofer, our colleague, and others have developed, and links also made with with agroecology by some authors from this field. So in France, in the late 2000s, what many actors would coin food resilience alimentaire in French, even if the frame, the parameter is maybe not exactly the same. But anyway, the key word was rather sustainable food, alimentation durable, or sometimes consommation durable, sustainable consumption. And it's progressively, but with the increasing institutionalization of food as a key element of territorial strategies with the territorial food project, for example, law that, not law, but it was included in the law, so related text that was established in 2014, and under the influence of larger debates and also action of social movements, that some networks started to use this notion in the late 2010. So here we just mentioned a few steps for the French colleagues and partners, like Grenier d'Abondance, which was created and wrote a lot of interesting matter on this issue and of its possible application in 2018. Interestingly, there's even been a text, we call that resolution, that was submitted to the French Senate about food resilience in a meaning of resilience of food, of procurement, like food security, linked to food security. In 2019, a bunch of different actors, some coming from the social movements, civil society, others who were rather like food experts, consultants, and even some who were coming from the large groups or French cooperatives, also gathered in an organization that was created in 2020, which is called CNRA, for Conseil National de la Résilience Alimentaire, which sounds very strange in French because a very well-known instance from that was formed at the end of World War II by the French liberation movement was called Conseil National de la Résistance. So this similar, like, how to say, tonality, or is kind of very strong and surprising. And also, I mean, was one of the reasons why personally I wanted to work on that and understand a bit better how all this was about. And so we're here now with the COVID crisis. In the last 2 years, have been having increased this circulation of the notion, and on the scientific side, the production, the writing of papers linked to this, or putting forward this notion. And I quickly, and the war in Ukraine, as you saw in the last weeks, also has increased this in a strong way, at least under the notion of security and provisioning systems. And when we look at the papers that mention this specific notion of food resilience, we see that it's inspired by the different approaches that have been developed that we see in the bottom. Some are more in the continuity of the notion of food systems resilience, often of food systems seen as in terms of provisioning systems. Some are more in the community resilience perspective, and others are very close to the agroecology vision of resilience. So we see this influence of the different concepts below in the current and recent papers that use this notion. So just to give you, it's just a few examples of some contrasted versions of the use of food resilience, considering their key objects, their scale, the related concepts, and how ecologization, which is at the core of our concerns in ATER, is tackled or not. For example, in one of the key FAO document about this and following, as I explained before, this this post-Hyogo strategy period, the key object is livelihood and the scale is the household, and the related concepts is rather the absorption of shocks, adaptation, with no real issue for the notion of for notions of agroecology or ecologization or whatever. In the often quoted paper by Tendall and all that defines food systems resilience, the key object is food security. Provisioning food system is seen as a provisioning system, mostly at the national, sometimes possibly a regional scale, and it's also strongly related to concepts like reaction to perturbations, absorption of shocks as well. In a very interesting paper by Harriet Friedman from 2017, she tries to apply the notion really strongly fidel or coming from the resilience ecological meaning of panarchy, but she applies it also to the food getting system, and tries to understand how new initiatives and also new forms of interactions with institutions may constitute the different step of the panarchy model. But as in the food regime theory, from where she comes in a way, she would rather tackle the issue of agroecological transition or ecologization through its opposite, that is intensification and specialization, even though there's this opening to the role of new initiatives. And finally, in this document coming from these documents, there are several, coming from the French networks that are, as I said, multi-actors network. It's also mainly a focus on procurement system and issue with at a local scale, with a strong focus on vulnerability and a perspective on pathways of resilience. And for example, in an interesting guide that has been published by this network, practices, agroecological practices at diverse scales are present, are tackled and considered as levels of resilience. So that's for just a few hours. And before I give the floor to Daniel, just I wanted to conclude on this trajectory to highlight a few shifts that we can observe. First, in terms of scales, where we see a shift from ecosystem scale to food systems or even territories. The notion of territorial resilience is also very present in France, at least in the areas, in the regions of the world where it's used, where we switch from southern countries to the northern world at large. Also in the key institutions that use it, roughly speaking, it was very present mainly present in the international institutions in 2000s and a bit beyond, and now much more, also very much by other actors such as NGOs, policy actors, and especially in France with this institutionalization of territorial food projects. In the approaches, and Daniel will come back to that, from ecology to interdisciplinary approaches with an increasing role of metrics, as many papers, many recent papers, and for example, the one by Tender, but many others, try to suggest methods and metrics to measure food resilience at diverse scales. And finally, in the objects to which this notion is applied, from ecosystems to farms and to food provisioning or food systems. And in a word, but Daniel is going to expand on this, we switch from a descriptive concept towards a more normative perspective. So Daniel.
Yes, okay. We are only 3 minutes left. No.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's so in the
it's
paper,
long to talk of a trajectory because
in the paper, as Claire presented, we try to discuss about the reframings of the notion of resilience in these very diverse and multiple uses. So we went back to the seminal papers, especially to around the definition of ecological resilience, not physics or psychology, but and we saw that it's important to remind that at the origin, in fact, resilience is a descriptive concept. In fact, resilience is to describe a phenomenon of persistence of system facing disturbance. So it's important because, in fact, in that way, resilience depends on the systems, on the system, on the nature of disturbance, but also on the descriptor. And so who will define the system? Who will define the persistence? So at the origin, it's important to remind that resilience is subjective, in fact, is descriptive and subjective. And I just put one example of recent articles who discuss the subjective nature of resilience. And this is a paper from Olivier Delerbre, who explained very clearly that, in fact, the definition of the persistence, so of the resilience, is effectively subjective, even for ecological systems. So I think it's we saw that it's quite important to remind this. So when we, with the multiple use of resilience, we observe and call an instrumentalization of the concept. And at the basis of this is in fact a strong reinterpretation of resilience, who becomes in fact a positive property of systems, and a property that we have to develop to cope with uncertainty of future. So we go from a descriptive ex post definition to an ex ante objective of adaptation. So it's a strong reinterpretation of the concept. And so this lead to, in fact, to redefine the concept as a norm. And it's very obvious, for example, in policies where you see that the use, in fact, of resilience is very related to a normative definition of resilience. And the consequence of that is that most of research, most of studies have explored, in fact, the way to develop an objectivation and quantification of resilience. So you can see that there are a lot of work to define, for example, the generic principle of how to build system or how to transform system in order to for them to be more resilient. So it's all the work you can see that relate resilience to the theories of complex systems or this domain. And of course, it's a lot of work and study to give metrics for resilience, with the great difficulty that when you see precisely this work, you can see that it's very difficult, in fact, to measure directly resilience. And in most studies, it's in fact proxy or indirect or indicator of the system itself, and not on resilience. The next slide, please, Claire. So, so it's very. So when we see, in fact, at the crossroad, in fact, of the evolution of the manner to define resilience and the application of resilience to agri-food system, we pointed some critical points. The first one is that as resilience loses its contingency and subjectivity, in fact, the good question inherent to resilience, as resilience to what, or resilience for whom, has completely disappeared. And this contributes to what we call the depoliticization of the use, in fact, of resilience. And this is reinforced by the use of this notion, resilience, as a kind of acritical notion. And you see easily that resilience is very often used at the place for, in fact, sustainability or other concepts about ecological transition, we can say. And so, in fact, there is a kind of depoliticization in this use of resilience. And another point is that in the way to define the problematic of alimentation, as Claire said, for example, with food resilience, focusing on security or supply, in fact, it leads to a kind of deconnection between of resilience with its systemic approach. And in this case, in the definition of food resilience, in fact, the consequence is that it puts, in fact, the agri-food system itself in the background. And this way, in fact, to put away the systemic approach contributes in the agri-food, in the food topics to what we call in the invisibilization, it's hard to say, of the social and environmental issues. It's not the only reason, but it contributes strongly to reinforce this disappearance of these dimensions in the food topic. And the last slide, it's just to say that in the paper, our intention was not to screw up the concepts, but trying to think how we can use the concept in another manner, not as an objective, but try to see if we can use it as an ethical mean, in fact, to better understand and interpret the dynamics in transitions. So what we tried to think, but we didn't go further in the paper, is how we can use resilience to another way to interpret, in fact, the discontinuities in the trajectory, how we can use it to elaborate an anticipation of trajectory, not a prediction, but an anticipation, and how we can use it to understand how these discontinuities are operating in the trajectory. And what is important for us is that we need to be back also to a not positive definition of resilience and see how the period of resilience is, for example, can be negative, for example, in the trajectory, and that there is no alignment, for example, between resilience and ecologisation. So perhaps it will help us also to see some disruptions in this trajectory. And the final point is that perhaps we can think about using resilience as more as how we can think resilience, and not as a norm, but how we can have a kind of resilience thinking, and try to think if it can be a heuristic and operational concept for crossing different point of view between actors and researchers, for example, and for giving interpretation, as I said before, on the trajectory. Claire, do you want to add something?
Sorry. No, I just wanted to add, but it's more for the further debates, that we would be curious also to have some feedbacks about how is this term used in other contexts and countries as well. We've already had this discussion in a previous workshop that we had a few months ago, but as there are new participants. But no, it's fine. I think I can stop the screen sharing.
So sorry, it was quite long. So we are very interested in discussing and to hear the reaction of Jocelyn and George about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle and Claire. Fascinating discussion indeed. And I am going to share you in being curious on what the discussion brings. Maybe Jocelyn, if you would be willing to get us started, and as a coordinator from the Urgency Network, share your reflections on the notion of resilience in how it's being used in the context you are working, and maybe also how you think that this discussion could, what could it bring politically for us. So go for it.
Sure. Thanks a lot. And thank you for inviting me to discuss the paper. So indeed, I really found it very, very interesting. I learned really a lot about the history of the concept and its different uses. I really appreciated the time fresco you showed also in the PowerPoint. Also the list of shifts in the way the notion is used. That was really useful to sum up a little bit the development of the paper. And personally, like when I think about resilience, I will come to my experience as a part of the social movement, but I have also heard about resilience in other contexts, completely different contexts. And one is the managerial language, like business language, actually. I think maybe it's more obvious in the Anglo-Saxon, the American context, like being a resilient employee or a resilient businessman able to overcome external shocks or bad news and so on. And also in sports, actually, quite surprisingly, like listening to football games, they also use the term resilience. Sometimes it's not so often used, but I think it's like getting into the common language. And quite interestingly, from my own perspective, indeed, I've been the General Secretary of Urgency for a decade. Urgency is the international network of community-supported agriculture, this kind of contract-based, direct selling, long-term commitment between consumers and producers. And we did a research about the response of our movement in the COVID-19 crisis. And this study is entitled Enacting Resilience, because the word came, or the term was used by the people we interviewed. We did 40 interviews with CSA network coordinators. We did also surveys, and it's just to say that the word is used quite widely nowadays in the social movement at different levels. And I think it's not just a matter of pleasing the funders, the donors. I think it really matches very well an overarching narrative about collapsing, like the climate change that is going to produce a kind of collapse or really a big crisis. And in the how to say, the objective of being a kind of prefiguration of what the world could become once it would be more sustainable, the term resilience is used really as the perfect word to match these overarching narratives. So I think there is really like something very powerful with the term, even when we take into account all the contradictions that are clearly explained in the paper. And also one thing to notice is that the respondents to our study, they actually, I mean, they stressed the fact that they noticed that the political or public discourse is saturated with this word. They say they are claiming that they are doing it, they are implementing resilience, they are not speaking about it. And for me, like the critique of resilience is something really new, actually, I have to say. Like it's something really recent. I think in France now there are a couple of critical articles, columns, or even a book, I think, which are criticizing the term. But it's pretty new, and I was really interested indeed to see all this critique about the fact that resilience can be, how to say, like a way to contribute to the consolidation of the statu quo situation, with a focus which is too much on the logistical kind of food security dimension of the concept. The fact that, after all, it's quite often used to say actually the supply chain has been able to face external shock without too much change. And indeed, this kind of invisibilization of the power dynamics, the power-laden relations, or I think it's indeed a very legitimate critique. Yes, I think actually one point, maybe it's more like a reflection, but each term, if we take a term in isolation, it sounds always perfect, but we also have to see like how a term is opposed or used instead of another one. For example, at some point, regenerative agriculture was used by the organic movement to counter the growing influence of agroecology. You know, there is also like food sovereignty against food security. So for me, it was actually very nice to see like maybe an underlying opposition between resilience versus transition, which I completely didn't see before the paper. I think it's not explicit like this, but at least it leads us into thinking about it. Then I have quite a few questions, so I don't know if I'm going to put them all at once or one by one, but I have questions, generally speaking, about or related to the ambition of the paper, which is to suggest ways to use resilience in a better way. So those are questions that I am asking as a social movement actor. One is related to the distinction between sustainability and resilience, because one point of the paper is to say that we are confusing the terms too much. And to me, actually, the distinction sounds still a bit theoretical. So I don't know if it's something for the paper or for now, but I'm looking for concrete examples of a disconnection between sustainability and resilience. Can we say, for example, that the current global food system is resilient to some extent because there are shocks happening all the time, and still people are, at least in the northern part of the world, people are still getting food, but it's not sustainable, resilient, but not sustainable. And can we say, if we go at the level of a single CSA, that, for example, a CSA is sustainable, but it's not resilient because, let's say, the farmer gets a burnout, and the CSA collapsed? Maybe like giving some examples of how to do, like in real life, this kind of distinction would be useful for people like me. Then I have another question, which is like this kind of invisibilization of ecologization of practices, the fact that the ecologization of practices is made invisible by this term. Is there, you think, an intention somewhere behind it? Is there, it's not about conspiracy or anything like this, but just asking, is there something that would motivate or that would be a reason for this to happen? I still have 3 questions. I hope it's okay. I think another question is like, can we do a parallel with other buzzwords? Because basically your paper is the history of a buzzword. And there have been other buzzwords in the past. Agroecology is one, and you know, there are different actors who try to reframe agroecology, for example, adding peasant agroecology, agroecologie paysanne in French, for example, to counter any cooptation. So could we see something like this happening with resilience? And actually I found a paper that was proposing the term negotiated resilience. I can share the link, maybe you know it already. Basically saying that, well, taking into account all these critiques we highlighted already, and saying, well, actually, we should not take resilience as something you have or you don't have, or something that is ex nihilo, but we should situate it. So we should go for a different approach, context-based approach, and so forth. So negotiated resilience or anything else, maybe you see already like seeds for a revised definitions of resilience. And maybe the very last question, it's actually a follow-up question to this one. For sustainability, I think there have been somehow the same history for this word as well. And, you know, like what one of the solutions that was found was to say, okay, there are 3 pillars of sustainability: social, economic, and environmental. Agroecology, same thing, the FAO came up with a list of 10 elements. Is there a simple formula or a way to say resilience should be associated with, let's say, 3 or 4 key notions? And I think you would be in the right place to contribute to the discussion and tell us, practitioners, like, okay, resilience, it is prevention, anticipation, adaptation, and diversity, for example. But I think like the follow-up part for your paper or for the discussion is to come up with a simple way to make sure people speak about the same thing more or less, and are not forgetting the key aspects that you are pointing out. I think that's it for me now. Thanks a lot, and sorry for the long list of the shopping list of questions.
Thanks a lot, Jocelyn. That's, I think, very, very stimulating to get the discussion started. I'm not going to give space to Danielle and Claire now to jump onto the list of questions, but I would rather first ask Georges to share his insight. George had also the chance to read the paper beforehand. So George, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Claire and Daniel. That was really interesting. And the paper is very well written, and it gives a historical approach, not to the as Jocelyn said, to this buzzword. I wanted to go a little bit beyond. I'm going to share a few slides that I use in my own research and my own classes, which might give some elements of answer to Jocelyn's questions. Actually, I was thinking about like some of your questions might be, approached by some of the arguments that I wanted to share with you. Before I start, I just made like a quick search on Google now, what's sustainability, just to avoid confusions and maybe speak on the same floor. Sustainability is the ability to be maintained at a certain level or rate. It is a buzzword, as you know, and it's basically a term that is a synonym for business as usual. How do we continue things as they are? On the other hand, you have resilience. Again, Google search, like very simple. We could go deeper, right, in the definitions or the sources, but this is just to have an idea of the common definition. Resilience is defined as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulty. So it has an element of a disruption of the business as usual. That said, a simple way of understanding resilience for me is by looking at the risk, the risk of occurrence of a disaster. And you have like three elements in a very simple equation that is quite easy to understand, and I like it a lot, and makes it very operational. You have three elements. You have the risk of disaster. It can be defined by the hazard, whichever hazard that is. It can be economic or ecological or social, even a social disruption. Multiplied by this ratio, vulnerability divided by response capacity. This means that every system will be defined by a specific level of vulnerability and will be countered by the actual response capacity or adaptive capacity of the communities. So basically the vulnerability, I like to think of it as a more like biophysical elements, describers or characteristics of a system, in particular farming systems or agri-food systems. And the other element, the response capacity or adaptive capacity, would be more likely to be the social and political aspects of it. So basically it's the concrete stuff divided by the abstract stuff that defines a system. Let me show you this example. This, for example, when we think about soil degradation, we have a timeline. You have a steady state, you have a degradation, you have a loss of soil, erosion, hurricane, whatever, you name it, what can happen for a soil to be degraded, deforestation, and you go back to another steady state, which is not necessarily the same as the previous one before the disruption. And the notion of resilience is quite varied. It doesn't really mean to go back to where we were at the beginning. It means just to jump back, and you can jump back at different levels. So to a lower level than before the disruption, or to a higher level, higher state than before the disruption. So it's quite, it means everything and it means nothing really, the term, as we see it here. You can rebound back to whichever state. So that's a first thing. Another element of maybe methodological, I was thinking of this shift from descriptive to normative. I think this is a combination between descriptive and normative, really. Trade-offs mean when you graph two competing objectives. In this case, we have coffee production, which could be an economic, even though it's an agronomic indicator, it can be translated into economic terms, into yield per hectare, and eventually in dollars or euros per hectare. And the amount of carbon stored, which would be here the ecological objective. So here, by using a trade-offs approach, we are opposing two competing objectives, one that is economic and one that is ecological. And depending on the cloud of the clouds of points that you have, you can have either synergies or actual trade-offs, no? Like the contrary of synergies. Let me show you just like the same thing, but in another example. This is from a paper of Jeroen Groot from Wageningen, where you have the two competing objectives, no? Environmental quality and productivity, which would be the economic approach. So you have a first here, number one, sorry. Number one would be like the status, the status where your farm is. And number two here in red is the status after a disruption. In this paper, I think it's an economic disruption. And number three would be like the recovered state, no? So you go beyond towards the synergy. So instead of losing levels in both objectives, you can also win. So this can help us as a proxy to understand trajectory. So when we measure indicators, we measure a state in a single moment in time, but we can measure the same elements, the same indicators in different periods of time, and that leads us to a sort of trajectory and an anticipation, like Daniel said, or Claire, I don't remember who mentioned, of anticipating what could happen when there is a disruption, right? Finally, well, not finally, I have another point, a last point, but this is my second point, is when we speak about transitions, what exactly are we transitioning towards, and what exactly are we transitioning from, and by whom and for whom? So this is a bit complex. Let me show it in images. This is from our colleague Paolo Titonelli, who's based in Groningen and Ciudad. And he was, this is a paper about actually assessing resilience and adaptability based on farming systems. No? So you have, again, two competing objectives, an ecosystem services and the farming intensity, which could be labor or could be inputs, or depending on, there are several ways of interpreting intensification or intensity. So basically, you have a trade-off in when you have less ecosystem services and lower intensity. But if you have like a lower ecological intensification system and that delivers enough ecosystem services, then you are in this transition point or in this status of more like agroecological systems. And this we can debate for hours on what does that mean, right? On the other hand, you have a technological intensification, but less ecosystem services, then we are based in a conventional system. So how do we go from one system to the other? That's the eternal question of agronomists and agroecologists nowadays. Who do we convince? Where, how, what do we do exactly? And how does that bring actual resilience, no? And the thing is that resilience also can be also conceptualized or is defined as the capacity of a system to resist a disruption and also to recover from it, as we showed with the soil degradation example. So that's the thing, like where do we stand means also what are we resisting from, and where do we want to go, or what capacity do we have to bounce back to a new stable status. And these are some of the elements I'm going to pass, because this you can find in the paper, and ways also of presenting the information. No? These are typical radar or amoeba graphs where you have three different types of farming systems compared to each other with the same indicators. And so these adaptability elements are what serve as a proxy for understanding resilience. And again, everything is a little bit of proxy of a proxy of a proxy, but I think we have some of the elements. And my final point, as an addition to Claire and Daniel's and Ika's paper, is this notion of the different food system discourses. No, there is very often uncertainty or lack of clarity on where we are placed on a system. So, for example, the supermarkets or the governments are more on the corporate food regime side, where you can see those are opposed in a way in that spectrum to the food movements, which is like food justice and food sovereignty approaches. these are really approaches to food system. There's nothing written on stone that this is that and this is not that. We are always confronted to a mixture of these things. However, if we say that, for example, supermarkets are the disruption of the system, of the peasant farming or the peasant economy, then how do we recover from that? And I think that's the question beyond this discussion, is that the spectrum is diverse and heterogeneous, and we are always encountering all of these discourses, no? Even though I farm my own vegetable gardens, I also go to the supermarket, so I am part of that neoliberal approach. But I also share my vegetables with my neighbors, so I'm part of that radical approach. So that's the thing. There's nothing really static or rigid. It's more like there's a fluidity in these discourses, and we better be clear on what are we resisting from, to, and where do we want to recover towards, no? That was my reflection for the day. Hope that was useful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Georges. It's like, I think it's like already super interesting. Like if you take a transdisciplinary approach to a concept, resilience is kind of bridging. It's being used in the natural sciences, agronomists like social sciences are used, and how we talk differently about it, maybe understand and also see different uses of it. So maybe like I will first give a brief back to Claire and Danielle for a short reaction maybe on some of the points made by George and Jocelyn. I don't think the ambition can be to address all of the points made, but maybe a few points you wanted to pick up, and then we still have some time for other questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jocelyn and George, because it's very rich, and fortunately we registered the session, so we can go back and think about the questions and the comments. So thank you very much. So I'm not sure that we will be able to answer and to all the questions, but we will be back to your comments. The first comment is that of course, there is an ambiguity and a reflection to have in the difference or the relation between sustainability and resilience, of course. And for us, in fact, resilience has no vision. Sustainability, even if we are not agree with that, there is a vision of the future, okay? And resilience, in fact, in its definition, it's not, there is not a vision, it's more to describe something about the behavior of the system. So the question is, and thank you, Jocelyn, the question is that if resilience, in fact, bears a vision of the future. I'm not sure of that. But perhaps it will be interesting to see if people using resilience, in fact, think about the vision of the future. But for now, and we describe it with other authors, that you can be very resilient and not sustainable at all. So this is not, clear. That resilience, it's very positive things, because systems can be resilient and to be adapted to facing disturbance, but in fact can be very unsustainable. And so it's, for now, it's very different for us. But of course, we have to think about if resilience can be defined in the way that it can not only describe some elements of adaptation facing disturbance, but also as a vision of the future. But it's why we didn't use it as a vision, but more as an analytical concept to understand the trajectory. But it's a very open and very interesting question. So Claire, you can add something, and I will be back on perhaps on the link on the question of the link with transition, perhaps.
Yeah, just about your question about could we compare your question just now about could we compare with other buzzwords. I think it's very different, for example, than the trajectory of agroecology, not least because agroecology is not only a buzzword as such, but rather a buzz model, like very, whereas resilience is rather a buzz concept. So it's not, I wouldn't say, I mean, I don't know what to conclude from this, but I wouldn't, even though, I mean, it's interesting, there's been quite many things, many analyses about the processes of appropriation of agroecology and so on, and that we could find some similar processes, but this makes a difference, I think. And I would rather actually, also because it's been maybe because it's been first reappropriated or by institutions, I would maybe rather compare this trajectory to the one of sustainable development that has been much used this way, although you're right to find similarities in terms of networks who refer to it with agroecology. So it's a complicated thing. I don't know. Our paper was not aimed at like comparing with other buzzwords. I think it's a good idea, but it's a complicated thing to draw, because it's also complex. Of course, it's an ecology of buzzwords in a way, or of concepts of. So it takes place also in this larger ecology of concepts that has been forged over time. So yeah, Danielle, if you want to.
Yes, I think Jocelyn and Georges, in different manner, opened the debate also of resilience, transformation, transition. In fact, Jocelyn, there is a very strong debate. It has several years ago. There was a very strong debate between the Resilience Alliance community and the community of transition with Andy Sterling, Mele Salish, and so. And they were very opposite, because they say that resilience, it's only effectively descriptive, and transition, there is an intention, there is an objective. So only transition can cope with sustainability issues. And the Resilience Alliance answer that, in fact, they don't speak only about persistence, but also about transformation. And you say that, Georges, that is, in fact, at the origin, the resilience describe when the system can resist, or it can jump, in another attractor basin. So they say, okay, we speak also about transformation. Of course, we can't speak about resilience without speaking transformation. But the transition community say, okay, but the transformation is not transition. That is, you don't speak about where to who, to what, who want to the transition, who manage it. So they always say that the intention, the way to manage that, it's not it's related to transition, but not resilience. So they object that resilience is not a good concept, in fact, to manage transition. But I don't know if you agree with that, in fact, this is a debate. So Georges, when you speak about agroecological transition, the question is that, do you need really resilience to speak about that? Is it useful to speak about resilience when you speak about transition, in fact, or not? So it's a question for
It's a question, yeah. No, I guess it's useful as long as the term resilience is accompanied by a certain threat, by a certain risk of disaster. And farming systems are continuously at risk of disaster all the time, whether it's climate, whether it's economic, whether it's pests, soil degradation, deforestation, social and political unrest. We're always at the brink of a disaster. So the term resilience is, in fact, important in designing agroecological systems. It's not only about having the food production as it is, it's also being alert of what could happen that would disrupt the food production, no? In a nutshell, I would say. That's my quick answer, let's say.
Thank you for this reflection. I just first wanted to say un grand merci to Jocelyn. I know he had to leave, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a
lot. I'm really sorry.
For sure,
I'll check the end of the recording. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jocelyn. So we have a stimulating discussion already going on in the chat as well.
Yeah, I can answer to the question about
maybe
the ecological version.
Okay. If you can hold it for just a second, I would also since we have only 15 minutes, I would like to collect some more points. Maybe there are other people that are listening who didn't put their questions in the chat and who would like to raise some issue. Maybe it could be a question to clarify something. Also, you could share some of your own experience in relation to the use of resilience, as Daniela mentioned initially. So I would like to first give an opportunity to that, and if not, we go to then we continue with the questions in the chat. There is Luz or Lutz who would like to. Hi, Lutz.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation, first of all, and the discussion. Working with Miserio, a German NGO, working in development, but I'm an economist by training. So this is a very different approach to resilience than I'm used to from my research work before. And it's very eye-opening generally that like development, the term is very broad, right? It's terms, and you really need to be qualified. What I would be interested in also is for me that this not only the question of how it is defined resilience, that it's relatively open, but also what are processes to define it, because we cannot get around discussing resilience in a policy context. So if I'm discussing as policy officer, let's say with the German government or so, I don't get around this term of resilience. But the question is, who is actually defining it? And it's often, it seems to me, for me, a top-down approach. And so that opens the question how we get out of that situation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lutz. Maybe we can take one or two more reflections. If anybody wanted to throw something in? If not, if you hadn't looked at the chat, there is a discussion going on about the notions of resilience and how it's used in psychology, and the parallel is made with Pedro introduced that, and then Fabienne comments on maybe the notion of attachement secure or secure attachment, could be something to
comment quickly on this.
Okay.
Actually, in the French context, at least, the success of the popularity of the psychological version may contribute to explain or may comfort the success of the food resilience concept, but I don't think it has been defined at all on the basis of this concept in psychology, food resilience. It's really, at least I have not seen, maybe there are some, but I have not seen any paper text that would say we rely on the definition by Cyrulnik to talk of food resilience. It's really established on the basis of the ecological theory. So then, yeah, of course, as we said, this thing that you can be resilient and not happy, and samely you can be, food system could be resilient but not sustainable. We have the same kinds of effects or processes or phenomena. But I wouldn't say, I mean, I'd be interested if there are some that it's directly, mainly an application of this psychological concept. But if there are some, if it's the case in some positions of social movements also, I'd be interested to know them. And I'm sorry, Lutz, I didn't really get your question.
So I'm gonna try to rephrase and combine with another couple of questions, but Lutz, please add if I misinterpret. But so from what I understand, it's like from a question that Vincent that we asked in the chat, as well as the last point that Jocelyn was making and the point that Lutz was making. It's like this question about like, okay, there is like, we need to qualify resilience, but not only like how to do, like what then give the content, but what is the process of getting to qualify. Jocelyn made a parallel with like, okay, resilience is like we have these pillars. Lutz was mentioning there is like a very much top-down process, which may not be interested. And in the question of Vincent, he makes the connection with like the idea of monitoring agroecology, and again, like there is a question of like how then do we in practice evaluate resilience. So to me, these questions are somehow connected or speaking to the same issue. So maybe Danielle or Claire, you have a reflection to share on that.
Yes. I think it's yes, there is an open discussion to have on how who define, how we defined, and how we evaluate. It is the same, in fact. And as I said, it's surprising that, in fact, today we are not able to evaluate resilience, of course, directly. So we have when you see the metrics, you know, all the things were explored in the way to try to catch something of the resilience. It's always indirect. It's indicator on the way to see the systems, if the system is complex, diverse, and so on, and if there are a lot of, for example, relationship between the component of the system, but not directly on resilience, only ex post, in fact. So I think the question of Lutz is very interesting because it's, yes, for me, it's the process of defining the vision we want to bear also in defining the resilience. And of course, the way to follow, to not, perhaps not to evaluate, but to follow or to manage in some way the resilience. So it's yes, it's a whole question, in fact, in several dimensions. Yeah. I don't know, Lucy, if I don't answer very well to your question, but
no, it's perfect. Thank you.
So Barbara, I didn't see the other questions in the chat.
Yeah. So I was thrown off the internet. It's a problem here. I think I'm back. Yeah. Am I? Yes. Okay, thank you.
You're with us, yes.
Okay, so I was just saying, like maybe other people also had ideas on this issue of like it's not only about what is in it, but how do we then define who is in the defining of what resilience may mean. And so I would also welcome reflections from others that wanted to jump in here? Maybe
there was an interesting comment by Vincent. If you're back and you want to talk, Vincent.
Yes, but I don't have access anymore at the chat, and so I don't know if what question
you were concluding, saying it was not very useful, and we tend to agree with that. That's part of our paper. So even though, I mean, we in the end of the paper, we try to, as Daniel showed towards the end, to open to like a kind of heuristic power of this concept. But so if you want to expand on this and why from your position you find it's not that useful as a concept?
No, it's not that it's not that useful, but in my field of work, I'm working on advocacy. And so I'm also confronting with the fact that I see resilience in discussion with people that are not really supporting agroecology or transformation of the food system, while the term resilience came to me when I was studying agroecology. So for me, it's connected because it's related to a systematic approach. So, so I was wondering how it can be used in an advocacy approach, because it's been used with by other people, because it's not that clear or easy to monitor. And at the same time, if we use the definition as a system that can survive shocks, but sorry, I'm not an expert. So I was saying in the chat that if we look at the actual globalized food system, which is not good, it can survive shocks, and it can survive shocks that came because of it, you know, like speculation, like food dependence of the dependency of certain countries vis-a-vis other countries. So yes, I was wondering if the term can be useful in an advocacy point of view, but I think that you answer by saying that we don't have enough. We cannot monitor it or easily define it, so it's complicated. But that was my thinking when I was writing the question.
Thank you. It's really interesting to have feedbacks from different positions. Thank you.
Do we have other people that would want to make like a general reflection on some of the discussion that we had? Myself, I continue to be puzzled, and probably somehow in line with the points that Vincent was just raising on, like resilience. Like the thing that stuck to me always is like we asked for justice and what we got is resilience. Like how much do we want to reclaim resilience as a concept in our movements? If it has been also co-opted by a sort of outsourcing of responsibility to keep an unjust and unsustainable food system in place, but it's a never-ending question. So I'm really glad that this discussion is going here. I don't know, maybe Claire or Danielle, you would want to make some final reflections before closing then the discussion here today.
No, the problem is that it's very rich, in fact, and that's each time we propose to open a discussion on resilience, it's poof, it's like un feu d'artifice. Je sais pas le mot en anglais.
It's fireworks.
So it's very rich, and we can be quite lost sometimes about that. So for me it's very strange, because when I'm discussing with resilience, each time I think I understand something, and after that it escaped to me, because it's like something with very difficult to catch, in fact. because of that is a buzzword, and people, very different people use it in different topics and in different arenas. So it's very difficult, in fact, to catch something sometimes. But so at this time, I don't think I can conclude about the usefulness of resilience or not. But I think with Claire, we are convinced that it's very useful to sometimes to be back to the original definition and to be aware about the confusion, ambiguity, and assay doubts, and try to, yes, when we speak about resilience, what about, we are speaking what about what? And I think the important thing also is who is speaking about resilience. So I think it's perhaps related to the comment of Vincent about the advocacy. Resilience to who, defined by who, and so on. So, but yes, we will listen again to all the comments and questions, because it's difficult to answer to all the questions just now. We have to think about.
Thank you so much, Claire. Did you still want to add, or
I mainly want to thank all the participants, and of course especially George Felix and Jocelyn for the comments. And I think that they're going to maybe not enrich our paper, but because at one point we have like to to stabilize it, but really the further discussions in our network and with all of you. So thanks a lot. It was really rich for us. And I agree, Fabienne. Resilience seems to a rather useful term for people who don't want the system to really change. I tend to agree, even though I think that many people also like truly and sincerely think that it may provide, regarding once again food systems, an interesting and a promising. So we were just trying to look at that.
Yeah, and I guess as long as the term is being used by many and powerful players, it is important to continue to engage with it. Whether to reclaim it or not is another question, but like at least engaging seems to be a worthwhile exercise. So thank you, everybody.
Just to say, Barbara, if somebody is interested to continue the discussion about resilience, we can organize the other webinar, like a series of webinars on resilience. So be free to propose another discussion from another starting point on resilience, and we can organize something.
Okay. So thank you so much. And as I said in the chat, like if you are not part of the Ather network, and if you want to continue to receive news from the consortium or continue this discussion on resilience, please drop me an email or put your email in the chat. And thank you so much, Claire and Danielle, for doing this work, and to George and Jocelyn for taking the time to reflect on it beforehand. And thank you to everybody else to be part of this discussion today. Wish you a pleasant evening.
Bye bye.
Barbara, tu peux sauver les questions?
Yes.
S'il te plaît. Parce que je ne sais toujours pas comment faire. Attends.